Imagine you are 10 years old. You are deep inside the earth, surrounded by a darkness so complete that it feels like a physical weight pressing against your eyes. You were just holding your father's hand, marveling at the shiny rocks and the vast echoes of your own voice. But then you took a wrong turn. You stepped into a side passage to look at a sparkle on the wall, and when you turned around, the blackness swallowed everything. You call out, but your voice just bounces off wet limestone, mocking you. You are alone. You are a child in a maze designed by nature to confuse and trap. As you crawl forward, desperate to find the main path, your hands sink into cold mud. Then you feel it. Water. It is not a puddle. It is a rising tide of black, freezing water that blocks the path ahead and seals the passage behind you. You are trapped in a flooded tube, the water climbing your chest, and the oxygen in this tiny space is slowly disappearing. This is not a nightmare. This is the true story of one of the most astonishing survival cases in caving history, and it is just the beginning of the horrors that wait beneath our feet. In the late 20th century, a 10-year-old boy went on a family vacation to explore one of the many sprawling cave systems in Missouri. Missouri is famous for its underground labyrinths, drawing thousands of tourists every year who come to walk the paved trails and gaze at the stalactites. For this boy, it was supposed to be a day of wonder. The family entered the cave with flashlights, moving through the large, open chambers. The air was cool and damp, smelling of ancient earth and minerals. The boy was excited, darting ahead to look at shadows and formations, feeling the thrill of being an underground explorer. But the cave is a place of illusions. Passages branch off in every direction, and what looks like a main corridor can quickly shrink into a dead end. As the family moved deeper, the group spread out slightly. In a moment of distraction, the boy wandered just a few feet down a narrow side tube. When he turned around to walk back, the main passage was gone. The geometry of the cave had tricked him. In the absolute darkness, with only a dim flashlight to guide him, every direction looked the same. He began to explore on his own, trying to retrace his steps, driven by a growing sense of panic. He crawled on his hands and knees, pushing deeper into the rock, hoping each bend would loop back to his parents. Instead, it led him into a nightmare. The narrow side tube he had chosen was not a way out. It was a sump, a section of the cave where the ceiling dipped down to meet the floor, partially flooded with freezing water. The boy found himself in a section where the water blocked the way forward and backward. He was trapped in a submerged tunnel with no clear escape route. The water was shockingly cold, a stark contrast to the cool but tolerable air of the main cave. It soaked through his clothes instantly, biting into his skin. Many adults would have completely shattered in this terrifying situation. The primal instinct when trapped in rising water is to thrash, to scream, to swim blindly against the stone until your lungs burn and your muscles fail. But this 10-year-old boy did something extraordinary. He forced his mind to be calm. He stopped moving. He looked around in the dim beam of his light, searching for an option, any sliver of hope. Above the water level, he noticed something crucial. The ceiling of the cave was slightly higher than the water in one specific spot. This created what experienced cavers call a bel air pocket. It is a small dome where air is trapped against the rock ceiling, a tiny bubble of life in a flooded grave. The boy pushed his head up into the air pocket and took a breath. He could breathe. He realized this tiny air space might save his life, but breathing alone would not be enough. The water was freezing and the air pocket was small. He made a critical decision that most adults fail to make in life-or-death emergencies. He decided to stop moving entirely. He decided to stay completely still. By not moving, he conserved his body heat in the freezing water, delaying the onset of hypothermia. Staying still also kept his physical exertion at zero, which meant his body required less oxygen. The less he moved, the less air he needed to breathe from that tiny, trapped bubble. He tucked his body into the cold water, leaving only his nose and mouth above the surface in the bel air pocket. He entered a state of suspended animation, fighting the urge to shiver, fighting the urge to panic, fighting the urge to swim. He remained in that dark, freezing tube for over 24 hours. He stayed motionless in the water, drifting in and out of consciousness, terrified that if he fell asleep, his face would slip under the water and he would never wake up. Meanwhile, above ground, his father and the rest of the family had realized he was missing. The fun of the cave tour had instantly turned into a scene of frantic terror. They called out his name until their throats were raw, but the cave swallowed the sound. They immediately called for professional cave rescue teams, knowing that a child alone in a cave system was a race against time. Rescue workers mobilized, suiting up in heavy gear, carrying extra lights, thermal blankets, and oxygen tanks. They entered the cave system, moving methodically through the dark passages. They couldn't just wander, they had to search systematically. Then they found a clue. In the mud on the cave floor they spotted small muddy footprints. The prints were tiny, a child's size, and they led away from the main tourist path, disappearing into a narrow, dark fissure in the rock. The rescue team followed the trail of prints into the flooded side tube. The water was deep, forcing the rescuers to swim through the narrow, submerged passage. As they pushed forward, their lights cut through the murky water. Finally, they discovered the 10-year-old boy. He was alive, his face pale and lips blue, resting in the Bel Air pocket exactly where he had placed himself a day before. He had survived over 24 hours trapped underground in freezing water by mastering his own fear and staying perfectly still. Rescuers carefully wrapped him in thermal blankets and extracted him from the flooded tube. He was taken to a hospital where he made a full physical recovery, though the psychological scars of spending a day alone in the dark water would remain with him forever. It was a miracle of survival psychology, a testament to the fact that sometimes, fighting for your life means doing absolutely nothing. But not every child trapped underground is lucky enough to find an air pocket, and not every group has the luxury of time to wait. To understand the true, unrelenting horror of the underground, we have to look at what happens when the mountain itself turns against you. In July 1993, a group of 12 boys went on a special field trip to Cliff Cave in Missouri. These were not ordinary kids on a family vacation. They were boys between the ages of 9 and 12, all living at a children's home in St. Louis. For these children, life had already been hard. Many came from broken homes, poverty, or neglect. This field trip was supposed to be a rare moment of joy, a break from the heavy reality of their lives. 2 adult counselors had organized the trip to explore Cliff Cave as an adventure activity. Cliff Cave was a popular destination for educational groups, known for its impressive entrance and deep, winding passages. The weather forecast that morning showed no signs of danger. The sky was overcast, but there were no severe weather warnings. The counselors had no reason to believe they were walking their vulnerable kids into a death trap. They descended into the cave, the boys laughing and shouting, their voices echoing off the limestone walls. The counselors led them deeper, past the twilight zone where the natural light faded, and into the zone of total darkness. They relied on their flashlights. The boys were fascinated by the underground world, pointing at the shadows, tossing small rocks into the dark to hear how far they fell. For a while it was everything the counselors had hoped it would be. But beneath their feet, deep in the bedrock, something terrible was happening. Miles away, a massive thunderstorm had suddenly formed. In the summer months, the Midwest is prone to violent, localized flash flooding. The storm dumped an immense amount of rain in a very short period directly over the cave's catchment area. The earth acted like a funnel. The water didn't soak into the ground fast enough. It pooled, found the cracks in the limestone, and began to pour directly into the cave system. The boys and the counselors had no idea. Underground you cannot see the sky. You cannot hear the thunder over the echoing walls. The only warning they received was a sound. A low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was the sound of water displacing air deep in the mountain. Then everything changed in an instant. One of the boys noticed water lapping at his boots. A moment ago the floor had been dry. Now, a stream of brown, muddy water was rushing past their ankles. The counselors froze. They shone their lights down the passage. In the beam they saw a wall of water coming toward them. It wasn't a trickle. It was a raging torrent, a flash flood roaring through the narrow cave passage with the force of a freight train. The water was black, filled with mud, debris and sharp rocks, churning violently as it consumed the cave. Panic exploded in the chamber. 12 young boys, suddenly realizing they were trapped in a stone pipe filling with water, began to scream. The counselors shouted for them to run, to climb, to get higher. The group scrambled up a steep rock slope on the side of the passage, slipping on the wet stone, pulling each other up by their shirts. It was a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. They managed to pull themselves onto a small ledge, a shelf of rock about 4 feet above the main passage floor. Seconds after the last boy was hauled onto the ledge, the flood hit. A wall of freezing, muddy water surged through the passage beneath them, filling the cave floor to the ceiling. The noise was deafening. It sounded like 100 freight trains passing inches below their feet. The water was so powerful it was eroding the rock, ripping stalactites from the ceiling, and sending boulders crashing through the dark. They were safe from the initial surge, but they were far from saved. They huddled together on the narrow ledge. There was no room to lie down. They had to press their backs against the cold, wet rock wall. The water below them was rising. It was rising slowly now, but it was rising. The ledge was their only refuge, and if the water rose another few feet, they would be forced into the flooded tunnels with no air. The temperature in the cave plummeted. The boys were soaked to the bone, their clothes heavy with muddy water. The hypothermia began to set in almost immediately. 9, 10, and 11-year-old bodies lose heat much faster than adults. The shivering started, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that racked their small frames. They huddled closer, trying to share body heat, crying softly in the dark. The flashlights began to die one by one as the batteries drained. The darkness closed in, leaving them with only the sound of the roaring water and the chattering of their own teeth. The counselors tried to keep them calm, telling them stories, singing songs, doing anything to keep them awake, because they knew that falling asleep in the cold was a death sentence. Above ground, the rescue operation was mobilizing, but it was chaotic. The roads around Cliff Cave were flooded. The rescuers couldn't even get to the cave entrance for hours. When they finally arrived, they found the cave entrance acting like a violent waterfall, pouring muddy water out into the valley. There was no way to send divers into that torrent. They had to wait. They had to wait for the rain to stop, and they had to wait for the water inside the mountain to drain. Inside, the boys were fighting a war of attrition against the cold. Hours passed. The water rose to within inches of their feet. Then mercifully it stopped. It stabilized. But the cold did not stop. The boys drifted in and out of consciousness. Some of them stopped shivering, which is the most terrifying sign of hypothermia, meaning the body was giving up. The counselors rubbed their arms, slapped their faces, screamed at them to stay awake. They were fighting a losing battle against the mountain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the water level began to drop. The roar of the flood softened to a dull rush. Above ground, the rescue team saw the outflow from the cave lessen. They geared up and entered the water. They waded and swam through the muddy, treacherous passages, following the maps of the cave, calling out into the dark. They reached the ledge. In the dim light of their heavy-duty flashlights, they saw 12 boys and 2 adults, huddled together like a nest of baby birds, pale, shaking, but alive. The extraction was grueling. The boys were too weak to walk. Rescuers had to carry them through the freezing water, passing them hand over hand through the narrow, flooded sections to get them to the surface. They were rushed to hospitals, treated for severe hypothermia and shock. Miraculously, every single one of them survived. But the trauma of being buried alive in the dark, listening to a mountain try to drown them, left permanent scars on their minds. These stories, the boy in the Bel Air pocket and the 12 boys on the ledge, expose a terrifying truth about our world. We build our lives on the surface, confident in the solid ground beneath us. But beneath that ground is a hostile, indifferent universe. It is a world of absolute darkness, freezing temperatures, and sudden violence. When we take children into these places, we are betting their lives on the assumption that the earth will remain stable, that the water will stay low, that the passages will make sense. But the earth does not care about field trips. It does not care about a child's fear. It operates on a timeline of millions of years, and a flash flood or a collapsing tunnel is just a blink of an eye to the rock. Think about the sheer psychological terror of those children. Imagine being 10 years old, floating in black water, knowing that if you fall asleep, you will breathe in the water and die. Imagine being 9 years old, pressed against a wet rock wall, feeling the water rise inch by inch toward your feet, knowing that if it goes up one more foot, you will drown in the dark. There are no monsters in these caves. There is no need for fictional horror. The geology itself is the monster. The pressure of thousands of tons of rock, the sudden surge of water with nowhere to go but through the cracks where you are standing, the absolute, suffocating lack of air. These are the things that haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They look at the ground differently. They know that the solid earth is just a thin shell covering a dark, churning abyss. The next time you walk over a patch of grass or see a hill in the distance, remember what is underneath. Remember that the ground is not always solid. Sometimes it is just a lid, and beneath it, the dark is waiting.